Hello, this is class for Tuesday, the 7th of April. I hope you're not getting as stir crazy as I'm just don't get out much. I garden in my yard. I've harvested my lettuce. I planted a second crop of lettuce. And I planted my snow peas. You better get out there and plant your snow peas because they don't like the hot weather that's coming. It used to be a fun trip was kind of go to the supermarket. But I have to admit, when I went to the supermarket yesterday, I was looking around thinking, who has this virus? Am I going to get this virus here? Because it's becoming it's becoming more and more widespread in Maryland. So there's concern. I see that GW made a decision, and in the summer, classes are not going to meet face to face. Okay, I understand that. How about the fall? Fall semester's 4 months away, right? In 4 months, they will not have a vaccine. It takes longer than that. There won't be a cure for this virus in 4 months. There will be many of us who've hunkered down in our houses and we don't have the virus. Are we going to go out and communicate in a world in which this virus is present in the fall in normal classroom activities? This is a big decision coming up. We may not see fall semester, is what some people are arguing to me. Now, uh, topic for today, the alienated middle class or alienated mass Americans. I consider this topic the most important topic that we touch on, with the possible exception of populism, because populism in the last 5 years has really reared its head throughout the world. And in this alienated middle class, I would say it's important because we live in a democratic republic. I think Cicero and Machiavelli are right about a democratic republic. Its strength is the closeness of government and the state to the people. The people participate, they produce the republic, they produce its policies, and so they feel part of it. This is how a healthy republic works. When people become alienated, they feel that government does not grow from them, but it's this other thing that does things to them. This does not speak well to the health of a republic in which alienation is widespread. So in examining this topic, I want to follow Aristotle's formula. You take a concept like alienated middle class, you look at what middle class means, you look what alienation means, and then you put them together, and then you see how can you use it to understand and to enlighten the world around us. So let me proceed along those lines, starting with the middle class. What is the middle class? People talk about the middle class all the time in the United States. I would say people run for office and they almost always say, I'll fight for the middle class. But they don't tell us exactly what do you mean by that middle class. So let's put some meat on what we mean by middle class. Take the traditional view. Class analysis became important with the insights of Marx and Engels. Their realization that society is stratified into these classes, that they have different interests, that they struggle, and much of politics is a reflection of the struggle of these classes. That's tremendous insight they made, and it's real important. So they brought to the fore this importance of class as a concept when we analyze politics. Now, what is the middle class? Well, let's look at the traditional view of middle class. The traditional view of middle class said that society has these stratifications. You have these rich, wealthy people at the top. You have real poor people. We define it as a poverty level, 14% of the population at the bottom. You have workers above those poor people who work from paychecks to paycheck, and they can live, but they don't live very extravagantly. Between the wealthy people and the workers, there's this big middle area. That's where the middle class is traditionally. Um, and they're really defined by their occupations. They are business managers, teachers, journalists, bureaucrats, clergy, judges, that professional class. That's the middle class there. Now, how do we separate this middle class from the wealthy people? You have to define what it means to be wealthy or rich. Again, people have different definitions. I like the ancient definition from Crassus. Crassus was the richest man in the Roman Republic at the time of Julius Caesar. And when someone asked him, what does a man have to consider himself rich? Crassus's idea was You should be able to raise, maintain, and equip your own army. That would be Crassus's definition. God, that'd put you in the $30 billion range today if we use Crassus's definition. Now, Crassus made his money off of real estate. And in Rome, if you were to have street cred, you had to have some kind of military career and do well. So Crassus took his army, and in the Levant, the eastern part of the Mediterranean, he fought against what the Romans thought of barbarians. His army didn't do well. He was captured, and then the people that captured him were so delighted that they now had in their custody the richest man in Rome, and they gave him his reward by pouring molten gold down his mouth. Now, I don't think that's exactly, he loved gold, but not that much. That would be the Crassus kind of definition, that you're wealthy. Uh, I would define the difference between wealthy and middle class and the different classes in this way. I think you're wealthy if you can live at the level you're living now and be comfortable and not have to work. That is, you had enough assets that it generated money that you could live how you live now. Now, my friends who are finance people tell me, Doug, you could live how you live now if you had $6 million in assets and they were conservatively invested, getting 5% a year. Well, I don't have $6 million in assets, so I would not be considered wealthy under that. But we have a certain percent, maybe a 2 or 3 up to 5% that I would consider under that definition wealthy. Then we have down below about 15% that live below the poverty level. Then we have this kind of working class in there. I think of that working class as merged with the professional class, and this being the middle class. And that's about 80% of the people in the middle between the wealthy and the poor people below. Now, when did America become a middle class society? I would say before World War II, we had a middle class, but it was small. It was maybe 25% of the population before World War II. World War II changed things. What a cataclysmic event. Uh, After World War II, the economy just took off in the United States, and the government helped people. There was a GI Bill where government picked up the tuition payments for people that wanted to go to college. For my parents, the important thing about the government's help of GIs was that they would loan you money to buy a house after World War II. There was a tremendous increase in home ownership in the United States. I think the way to look at World War II is probably like the deceased historian Stephen Ambrose looked at it. You can see Stephen Ambrose if there's anybody that likes this documentary series called The World at War, made by the Brits by the Thames Production Company. It's about 20 hours long, and you could really, that's how I learned about World War II from that series. And in fact, what they do, it's made in the 1970s, so they interview a lot of people that were involved in World War II, decision makers and grunt soldiers, everybody. It's really good. And so you look through, well, something that I learned about it was that I always thought that the American Army won World War II. Silly me. Then I went to Paris to the Military Museum where I found out the French Army won World War II. I didn't know that. And then I think looking at the comments of Professor Ambrose in the World at War series, at the very end of the series, they ask historians who won World War II, and he gives the answer. Well, out on the battlefield, the Red Army won World War II, and I think he's right. I mean, the Red Army ground up the great divisions of Hitler's Wehrmacht, his professional army, chewed them up and pushed all the way into Berlin. So they should get credit for that. That was quite an accomplishment. But if you look at it another way, look at what country was better off after World War II than before World War II. And after World War II, Japan and China over in Asia, the Philippines, they were in ruins. Over in Europe, Britain had had the Blitz, undergoing the Blitz, and all the missiles, the first missile technology, destroying London. It was a mess. France armies had moved across it several times. It was a mess. Germany was just utterly destroyed. So was the Soviet Union. So what characterized the world after World War II was the destruction. The one country that wasn't like that was the United States. It did not. It had the attack on Pearl Harbor, which is just a small part of the United States. And after, just as World War II ended, it had more food than it could eat, more clothes than the people could wear, more houses than the people could live in. The United States was much better off after World War II than before World War II. So, in a sense, the United States won World War II and it created this middle class society. Uh, Ambrose cites the statistic that in the year after World War II, over 50% of the world's GDP was produced in the United States. So you had this economy going like gangbusters after World War II. And this is what created this middle class here in the United States, this affluence that could support a middle class. Now, that's my idea of middle class. You got an idea who I mean. Now, how about the word alienation? What does the word alienation mean? It's a word that was popularized by Marxists. And the idea is a person is alienated when something they should feel part of is like an alien separate from them. So Marxists thought of the new industrial world that they were analyzing, that workers were alienated from their work. That is, the things that they produced weren't part of what they produced. Earlier, people produced things with their skills, like harnesses and newspapers, and so they felt it was a part of them. After you get industrial manufacturing, people don't feel that way. When I was a steel worker, we produced tons of steel, but I didn't feel it was a part of me. I was just this small cog in a wheel. That's the Marxist idea of alienation, this idea of something being separate from you. And my idea of the alienated middle class is that there developed sometime after World War II a kind of alienation of America's middle class from its government, from its state. That is, the government didn't seem to issue from them and they didn't feel part of it. They thought of it as some separate thing that did things to them and they didn't trust it. That's the idea of alienation. And I think we tap into that alienation when we ask Americans, do you trust government to do what is right and to act in your own interest? Well, we've been asking Americans that. Do you trust government to do what is right all of the time, some of the time, or it's all of the time, most of the time, some of the time? And we think people that trust government all of the time and most of the time, they trust government. Otherwise, the other people don't trust government. Now, we've been testing and measuring people's attitudes about trust in government going all the way back to, I have in this chart, back to Eisenhower in the 50s. And this is what it looks like. The green is just African Americans. How many trust government? What percent? The gold is white people. And you can see, look at back in the 50s, both blacks and whites, they trusted government at a high level. You're getting in the figure like 75% of Americans trust the federal government to do what is right. And then you have this rapid drop off and it's really low, sometimes going below 20%. And this marks this era of alienation in government from Americans. And in fact, I have in the middle period that we're talking about of this alienation, 1992, I have some information from the American National Election Study. It's done by the University of Michigan. And they ask people all kinds of questions about their attitudes. And this is the question of trust that I'm interested in, and other questions. For instance, in 1992, 2/3 of Americans think the tax burden is too high. The idea that people aren't taxed at the right level is part of alienation. 2/3 think the federal government is too powerful in 1992. On race, 3/4 of Americans do not support the racial gender preference policies of the federal government. They they want the principle of symmetry to be in effect, which doesn't allow any favoritism of any group because of skin color. So they disagree with policy on that. 11.6% of Americans support the ban on public school. Only 11.6%. The others disagree. 19% trust the federal government to do what is right. You trust the government all of the time, most of the time. It's only 19% in 1992. It used to be 75% when Eisenhower was president. Also in 1992, the American National Election Study, 47% think the federal government has quite a few crooks in it. 3/4 of Americans think the government is run by big interests for their own benefit. Again, this is signs of alienation. Now, I'm arguing that this poll, and this is not atypical during this period, that this poll taps into this alienation that people feel of the federal government. and they still feel it. Now, if you're accepting that there is this alienation in the United States, the next question, and what I want to touch upon, is this. Why did this alienation occur and why is it important? Well, it's important because if people feel alienated from their government in a democratic republic, that's not healthy. That's an unhealthy sign that there's not a good relationship between government and its people and that the democratic republic is not working properly. Now, why did we get that? Why, when Eisenhower was president after World War II, did people not feel alienated? And then they built this alienation built up, and it's been in effect for decades here. And I'm going to look at some of the questions now. Uh, First of all, Americans now feel economic insecurity that they did not feel when Eisenhower was president. Economic insecurity meaning what? Let's use my parents as an example. My father was a World War II veteran, a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne. Matter of fact, his unit, the 506, is featured in a long movie called Band of Brothers, if you've ever seen it. So this is a World War II veteran's family. He comes home, he's married, he has kids. The federal government moves the economy forward, so there are jobs. They give him a loan to buy a house. Things are going pretty well economically after World War II. He could work, not have my mother work. We had 3 kids at the time. His mother could live with him. So we have 3 adults and 3 kids, and he's not even a college graduate. And he can earn enough money to get by and to live in America, like the lower middle class. He came back from the war. He was a taxi driver then. When I was born, he was a milkman. You can look it up. There used to be somebody who delivered milks just like they deliver newspapers to your house. Uh, because people had big families with children. They didn't drink soda like they do now. They drank milk. And so there was a route that a person used to deliver. My father did that sort of thing. And so he could own a house. He could raise this family and be the sole breadwinner of a family. Uh, he could enjoy the new emerging technology that would come along. The new emerging technology when I was a kid was television. We got a television a little later than some families, but by 1953 we had a television. Now, that's what life was like, and just after World War II, and government gets credit for that. Remember, progressivism says government has a major responsibility to take care of many facets of American society. The economy is one, so government's getting credit for that. You could get all kinds of jobs at the time. We made all the electronics here that we use. The jobs paid well. You could be a steel worker. Even in the 70s, I was a steel worker. That's the end of the era when we have a lot of steel workers. Automobiles were overwhelmingly made in the United States, and the jobs paid well. We had all these high-paying jobs. The economy did well. Americans flourished, and they felt a trust in their government, that the government was contributing to this. Something happened. Americans don't feel economic security now. What if you're a person who didn't graduate from high school? Do you think you're going to be married with 6 people in your household and you're going to live and buy a house in the United States and feel economically secure now, as my father did? That's changed now. And so as people have become economically insecure, government gets blamed for that. Government gets credit when the economy is doing better. Government's going to get blamed when it's not doing as well. So this economic security ended, and I think you could argue globalization is what did this. I've talked several times about where I grew up in Cleveland. Those jobs in the 18 blast furnaces have disappeared. Uh, there was just last year the closing of a big General Motors plant in Lordstown, Ohio. If you ever drive along the Ohio Turnpike, you look to your right when you get over the Ohio border from Pennsylvania. There's a huge plant where they made the Chevy Cruze, completely shut down. Those are thousands of jobs that are lost that pay well. This has happened throughout the United States due to globalization, so that people who are not part of the university credentialed managers and professionals, they can't go and get a job in which they can live well and feel economically secure. And government gets blamed for that. Many times, people, working class people in Cleveland would ask me, how did the government let all these foreign companies move through here and destroy our economy like this? We just don't understand it. This globalization has had a negative effect on many Americans. Now, a second reason for this alienation that I would point to is the tax burden. The tax burden has grown since the days of Eisenhower. It used to be at the time when I was born, Harry Truman was president, And they used to take 12% out of the average American's paycheck and send it to Washington in taxes. Now it's over 26%. That 14% jump is a big jump in the money that comes out of people's checks. So they see government as not performing well and taking more and more of their taxes. So that most Americans now see their tax burden as too high. Uh, that was the case throughout this alienation period. I'm beginning to see the last 2 years polls in which Americans about even numbers say, well, my tax burden is about right. So that's kind of some progress on this idea of tax burden. Uh, Perhaps there'll have to be a tax increase because of all the money we've been spending, especially with the COVID-19 problem. So if we begin to raise taxes again, I think that alienation from coming from the tax burden will probably increase in the United States. Now, most of that period, Americans thought they were too highly taxed. How did the parties deal with it? Well, Walter Mondale realized when he ran in 1984 that we had borrowed too much money and that we should raise taxes. And he actually ran in 1984 on a tax increase. Many analysts say that's why Mondale didn't stand a chance against President Reagan. Americans don't want to see their taxes increased. What it's come to now is maybe Senator Sanders' idea that the great bulk of Americans pay enough in taxes. It's that 1% or that few percent at the top that aren't paying their fair share, and that we can take more out of those people to pay for all the government that we want here in the United States. I would give a third reason for this alienation for government is that crime has soared in the United States. And that's a government responsibility to protect us from crime, to keep crime down. Um, when I ask older Americans, meaning the generation before me, the biggest change in the United States during their lifetime, a number of people have told me the crime rate. The crime rate is so much higher that in the 30s and in the 40s, when we went on dates and inside a city, we could go to a park, we weren't afraid that we would be attacked. That changed starting in the 60s and 70s and 80s in the United States. We had this soaring of the crime rate. In the last 15 years, it's kind of moved down a bit. Now it looks like it might move back up. But government gets responsibility. When people don't feel safe, the entity that they're going to blame is government, because that's a primary government responsibility throughout the ideological spectrum. People believe that in the United States. A fourth reason I would give for this alienation of the middle class from government is that government borrows too much. Most families understand it's fun to spend money, it's not fun to earn money. You have to bring balance between what you spend and what you take in. That's only responsible. Everyone knows families which do not do that, and they run into financial trouble because they spend more than they take in. The same model is kind of used for government. Government should spend about what it takes in. Under extraordinary circumstances like war, it might have to borrow more, but it shouldn't be just normal budgeting that we borrow money. The US government borrows money all the time. The debt during this period has moved up and up, higher and higher. Matter of fact, you can go to the Department of Treasury. I just did, and I looked up what is the US debt, and the US Treasury gives the debt to a penny. This is on April 3rd, 2020. The federal government, through the Treasury, tells me that the amount of accumulated debt that we have to pay off in the United States is 23 trillion, 908 billion, 330 million, 765 dollars and 40 cents. 40 cents, not 39, not 41. $23 trillion. It seems to me a lot. Does it seem to you a lot? That means we got to service that debt. And we have interest rates low now, artificially kept low. So I bet it's about $250 billion a year to service that debt. If interest rates go up to market levels and this continues to grow, this is going to be a big chunk of our expenditures in government to service our debt. Not only that, this doesn't take effect that Congress and the president is signing huge bills, $2 trillion bills. I think they've signed off on $4 trillion and they're looking at another one. Where's this money coming from? Are we going to tax ourselves for this? This 23 will soon move up to 27 trillion. Plus, not only that, because we're in this terrible, maybe even a depression because of COVID-19, we're going to take less in taxes, so it's going to go up higher. Uh, Most Americans see this as being irresponsible, and that government's responsible for that. Uh, you might, in our discussion board, uh, tell me whether you think I'm crazy for being so upset about the debt. But I, like most people that belong, you can look at the Concord Coalition, people that are concerned about this borrowing of money, and we think it's going to be a problem in the future, especially for your generation. Another reason for alienation on the part of Americans. Uh, Probably one of the more socialized parts of American society is education. About 80% of Americans go to a government run school. Well, when we do international tests and we look kindergarten to the 12th grade, our kids don't do very well. And so government's not doing a very good job of educating people before college in the United States. So it gets some blame for that sort of thing. Uh, a seventh reason for this alienation: we launch wars which we don't do well on. How long have we been fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq? Is there any end to it? How did we ever march our army into these places and think that it would be easy? Uh, this again leads to an alienation. Let the federal government talk about marching the army into another Middle East country, and I would say in Congress, their telephone switchboard will light up like a Christmas tree. Americans don't want any more part of this sort of thing. Another reason for this alienation is some people think we should protect our borders, and it just shouldn't be porous that people come here and that they compete for the jobs that are hard for downscale Americans to come up with. And so they're alienated for government for not doing that, for not having a policy that accords with the laws of the United States. If the elites don't like the laws on immigration, they should change them. Otherwise, their policy should be that laws. This is a problem here in the United States. So what I want you to do is go to the discussion board, comment on what I've said today, give me some idea about what you think about this alienation, and I'll talk to you on Thursday, and I'll finish up this topic of the alienated middle class. Take care.